So welcome to our Global Public Health Challenges and Opportunities Insight from the Expert series. This is a 4-part series happening over the next 3 weeks at the same time, so please also feel free to come to those events as well. We really value your participation, so during the talk, please feel free to type comments in the chat box, and also feel free to pop questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as possible as we can at the end of the talk. So please also note that this session will be recorded and it will be available next week if you want to refer back to the talk, get some references, or share with colleagues. And again, we're really excited to have such a great turnout here this morning. And we're really lucky to have today's presenter, Professor Steve Hanney, and their talk is on assessing and accelerating the impact and value of health research, examples from screening, musculoskeletal disease, and vaccines for COVID-19. So Steve Hanney is Emeritus Professor in the Health Economics Research Group at Brunel's Department of Health Sciences. He co-created the Payback Framework in the mid-1990s and since then has worked with colleagues at Brunel and elsewhere to develop and apply this in other ways of assessing the impact and value of health research and analyze how to accelerate this process. From 2016 to 17, he has co-edited the WHO-founded journal, Health Research Policy and Systems. So welcome, Steve, welcome everyone, and please feel free to go on with today's session.
Thanks very much, Adrienne, and good morning, everyone, and many thanks for joining. And so as this is the Global Health series, I thought I'd start with an image of the globe. But it is also, as Adrienne kindly mentioned, the logo for the journal Health Research Policy and Systems, which I edited. And the globe there comes from WHO's logo, and the candle comes from this wonderful quote from Thomas Jefferson. "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper candle at mine receives a light without darkening me. That ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe for the moral and mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition." Now, I know some of the language isn't very inclusive by today's standards, but I thought it was wonderfully inspiring sentiments. I've actually used it over the last 4 years in various presentations to remind people that some US presidents, at least, were capable of inspirational thought. Right, now it's not so necessary to do that anymore, thank goodness, but still, it's very important quote, really, form the first point in my overview of the webinar, which is that historically there has in fact been limited interest in societal impact of research. There have been a few exceptions, like Thomas Jefferson, who was of course a great inventor, but generally assessment of research focused on academic aspects. But now, impact assessment, the wider impact assessment is becoming much more interest. And partly this started with Payback Framework that we developed right back in the 1990s here in Brunel. And I'm going to give an example of how it could be applied to the AAA, abdominal aortic aneurysm screening study. But then if you want to look more comprehensively at a whole body of research and find out what the impact of that was, well, we developed a series of studies called Medical Research, What's It Worth? And applied them to public and charity medical research in particular fields. And I'm looking particularly here at the example of musculoskeletal research. And then the work we've done in analysing why the impacts are at a certain level has focused on the time that it takes to go from early research to translation. And so we've applied some of that most recently to COVID vaccines. So a year ago, I don't think any of us, it wouldn't occur to me, for example, that just on Saturday, I would be given a vaccine for this new disease that was threatening everyone. I'm feeling pretty good. A few side effects, a bit weary. And the worst side effect that they don't tell you about is I've actually lost my glasses. There are new glasses. It's really annoying. My wife and I can't find them anywhere. So just beware. So why has there been this increased interest in the wider societal impact of health research and assessing it? Well, first of all, for accountability, to justify previous public and charitable research funding, for advocacy, to encourage future research, further research spending. funding, and then for allocation to inform research funding allocation decisions, and for analysis. Assessing research helps to identify factors associated with achieving impact, ways to better manage research, and to speed up translation. So going back, okay, not quite as far as Jefferson, but back to the 1990s, Martin Buxton and I developed this payback framework at the Health Economics Research Group here at Brunel. And it consists of two elements: the multidimensional categorization of benefits and a model for how to assess them. So the multidimensional categorization has 5 elements. The first 2 are the traditional academic impacts that had long been assessed. So in other words, the knowledge that's produced and the research benefits, the targeting of future research capacity building. And these are still important, where we've never said that the assessment of the wider impacts should replace those. It's just we've said the assessment could benefit from going wider and cover, and we've got 3 very broad categories. I know there'll be lots of subcategories, etc. But basically, we've looked at informing policies and product development. Then there's the health gain and the health sector gains, health equity, and then the wider economic benefits, so the to GDP and the value of any health gain. Then the model shows where to look when assessing impacts, and also how to identify one project's contribution from that of all the other research that might be going on and other factors. So the model has 7 stages. These include the research stages, which are already embedded in the wider stages that take place in the wider society. And then there are 2 interfaces between the research steps and the other stages linked into the wider society and the context of the professional political system and also the wider stock of knowledge. So let's look at the payback framework. Now, I know it looks rather linear, but you'll see there are lots of feedback loops, lots of feed-forward loops, and also you'll see that the research stages here are embedded in the wider society. So at the start, the topic issue identification, this can be based on sort of the needs assessment from the healthcare system, or it can be, or it can be based on the sort of unfinished scientific priorities that come from the stock reservoir of knowledge. And then there has to be the interface when this product is selected, then the various research stages, the inputs, the processes, and the primary outputs. And this is where we find the first examples of the impact categories. So the primary outputs, the knowledge that's produced, and the research training, and this can feed back into the wider stock of knowledge. It can feed back to trained researchers who might do further research, and also it can be disseminated into the wider political healthcare system, etc., through the dissemination. And then this is as the secondary outputs, what we call them. So this is where the research making an impact on policy making or on product development, and then that might be adopted and inform practice and practitioners. But of course, sometimes, say, leading medical academics will read the research findings directly. They won't need to wait until there are guidelines to adopt it. They will start adopting it because they've seen in the literature that these good new ideas. And so they might then adopt it, and then they will feed back to, say, their own professional bodies or to the political parts of the healthcare system and say, look, these are really good new approaches. We ought to be adopting them. So again, that will encourage further uptake. And I know there's lots and lots and lots of stages to get from sort of guidelines to actual practice. But then when it is adopted, when ideas are adopted, then it will lead on to the final impacts. Now you'll see that there was a team of us from Brunel and from WHO doing produce this, but also we applied a lot of the payback work in conjunction with people around Europe, especially Jonathan Grant and Steve Wooding in various papers there. So that is doing individual case studies. And how did we apply it? Well, one of the key things is that all our methods we use, the surveys, the interviews, the documentary analysis, and the case studies, and the data presentation, were all informed by the payback framework. So they were the stages, were the basic framework that we use for our surveys, for our interviews, in developing case studies, and also we covered all the payback categories. Then it has been quite widely applied, as you can see, Australia, Canada, and various European countries, Spain, Netherlands, Ireland, USA, EU research, also Hong Kong, Malaysia, but then it also informed some of the strategies of WHO and ICDDRB, which used to be known as the International Centre for Diarrheal Disease Research in Bangladesh. Now, there are, of course, problems with assessing impact. One of the main ones is how do you identify the degree of attribution or contribution made to the specific research, given all the other research and the other factors? Well, the points I've just been making will help here. So in other words, examining the wider context to see, did this research group talk to potential users when they actually formed their question? Were the stakeholders engaged in the actual processes of undertaking the research? Was the dissemination targeted at potential users? If all those factors, so studying those when doing a case study, can help to build up a case that this particular research, if it did, was one that was responsible, or at least contributed to the new policies, the change practice, etc. Now, in analysis also can form analysis. Key point: societal impact is not always achieved. We've kept emphasising that. Not every piece of research will lead to the wider impacts, otherwise it probably wouldn't be research. But it does help identify, doing the impact assessment, the factors, the mechanisms that increase the chances of achieving impact. So a focus on the needs of the healthcare system, engaging stakeholders, the creation of receptor bodies. This isn't so much by the researchers, but by the system. So there are structures into which the research might feed to be taken notice of. Now, of course, many will now, listening, will only be too aware, in the way they weren't when we first started this work, that their research is now assessed, because the UK now has developed the National System of Research Impact Assessment for allocating research funds and also for advocating and for accountability. It's called the Research Excellence Framework, introduced in 2014, and it is probably globally the leading national impact assessment approach. So where did the idea of the Funding Council have, where did I get the idea from of using impact case studies in the REF? Well, immodestly, he says, they told the House of Commons Science and Select Committee in 2010 that in developing our proposals, we drew heavily on existing evidence. They found that the existing evidence came in particular, they said, from the health area, and they actually just referenced 2 studies, and those are the 2 that we're looking at today: the Payback Framework and the series Medical Research, What's It Worth? By then we'd only done the 1 study in medical research, What's It Worth, in cardiovascular disease. They went on to say that no requirement on individual academics to demonstrate impact from all their work. A selected number of case studies will represent the portfolio of activity, which is exactly what we'd always advocated. Of course, many others were also involved, and just picking out 2 in particular, the most important players, one of whom was Jonathan Grant, then at RAND and now at King's, and Claire Donovan, who was then in Australia and is now at Brunel. So let's look at one particular case study, one particular piece of work. Now, I've got a warning up there. This is for the next slide. If any of you are very squeamish, if only if you're very squeamish, you might want to look away when I say I'm going on to the next screen. But the banner here, those of you who've been at Brunel for a while will know that Brunel was 50 a few years ago, and they produced 50 amazing facts to celebrate the 50 years, one of which referred to this piece of work I'm going to talk about, a screening study, and the fact that it saved lives. But the earliest bit of the research done was a small-scale study in the US Army Medical Center in El Paso in 1983. But then globally, the key trials were actually in the UK and were led by Alan Scott from Chichester Hospital. And the point here is, look at the dates. The first study, or pilot study, was actually somewhat overlapped by the later main trial, and that is significant. And these trials do go on a long time. Brunel's HERG was asked to conduct the cost-effective analysis of this trial, and so the impact could be described using the Payback Framework. Also, we had it as a REF impact case study, and it got top rating. I mean, I didn't do any of the work on this. It was Martin Buxton and others at HERG who did the cost-effectiveness analysis. And we have also used it, as you'll see later, in the time-lapse analysis. So this is, sorry, I've gone on the next screen now, should I say. So this is already very bad news. Obviously, this is what shows what an abdominal aortic aneurysm is, and 80% of men die if such an aneurysm ruptures. So studies of ultrasound screening were conducted with the aim of identifying the men at risk, because it's usually asymptomatic. So this is the way you can tell if someone's at risk, and then that can inform the timing of elective surgery for people who are at risk. So I'm now moving on quickly to the next screen, and this shows how we analyze this series stream of work using the Payback Framework, and it won quite exceptional levels of impact. This is not typical, but it illustrates how all 5 categories might be relevant. So there was knowledge produced. There were many articles, including in the Lancet, to reference hundreds of times. It targeted some future studies, so extending the AA screening to women. The prevalence in women was much less. So the question was it worth doing was it cost effective to extend screening? And that study too was done partly at Brunel by Matthew Glover, who's on the staff now. Now, this work informed many policies. So in January 2008, Prime Minister Brown announced the introduction of AAA screening. Actually, he did so in the speech that he made marking the 60th anniversary of the NHS. It has also informed official guidelines in the USA and Sweden, and guidelines produced by the surgeons, professional bodies in the US and Europe. And in the US Congress, actually passed an act, the Screening for Abdominal Aortic Aneurysms Very Efficiently, the SAVE Act, which introduced this screening into Medicare. Health improvements have occurred. So the implementation in the UK was from 2009, 26 years after the first US study. And in England, 300,000 men annually get called at 65. I had mine a few years ago, approximately 75% acceptance rate. And the Department of Health estimated that over 20 years, it might result in a health gain of 130,000 quality adjusted life years. Those figures come from a few years ago, maybe slight difference now. But it also had an economic value. So the Department of Health estimated that the quality value over the 20 years would be almost 4 billion. Now, it's very rare to be able to show such levels of impact from individual studies. So UK research funders were keen to see if more comprehensive studies could be done. So this is where Medical Research What's It Worth series started. We say we've done 3 studies. First of all was cardiovascular disease in 2007 and 8, then one for cancer, and then this is the 3rd, musculoskeletal disease, which seemed most relevant for this particular department. This is the paper, and you see the research team again came from Brunel, King's College London, which is where some of the people from RAN, like Jonathan Grant, had moved, and also some were still at RAN Europe. And funded by the Academy of Medical Sciences, Arthritis Research UK, Medical Research Council, National Institutes for Health Research, and Wellcome Trust. So all interested in what the benefits were. So how do you do this? Well, 4 elements we had to do. First of all, we had to calculate research investment, then the issue of the time lag. Well, this is because in calculating rates of return, you have to discount the value of the gains every year since the investment was made. And now also, what proportion of the health gain, UK health gain, can be attributed to UK research? Because what we looked to see how much benefit was coming in the UK from these treatments, research-based treatments. But we were not looking specifically only at UK research. So we had to make a way of calculating how much of the benefit we could allocate to UK research. And then fourthly, here, the key thing is we've got the net health gains. This consists of the health gain monetized, which is a horrible sort of health economics word, it means sort of valued, minus the costs of the healthcare delivery. So looking at each of these in somewhat more detail. So first of all, looking at the first 3 items, the research expenditure, time lags or elapsed time, and proportion of research from the UK. So we had to include all the research funding, of course, from Arthritis Research UK, but only a percentage of funding from the other main funders, and that took some time to work out. Our best estimate was a current value of 2014 prices with £1.4 billion. But we also, for all the figures we did, calculated or gave what might be a low figure and a high figure so that we could do some sensitivity analysis. Then the time lag between the research and implementation we estimated this by looking at the time between the publication of relevant clinical guidelines, there were lots and lots of guidelines in the particular field, and the publication date of the papers cited on them. Plus, of course, we had to add time in for the research conduct and for guideline implementation. Now, as you can see, these are estimates. These are not hard and fast figures. So we definitely needed to put in also, a short time estimate and a long time estimate. Then for research attribution to the UK to determine the percentage of the health gain coming from UK research, again, we used the same set of clinical guidelines and looked at the addresses on the papers, including in those guidelines. And here, our best estimate was 30%, low figure was 20%. We didn't actually use a high figure for this because the 30% figure itself was much higher than our best estimate in the first two studies for cardiovascular disease research. So this is now moving on to estimating the actual health gain. So first of all, we identified and prioritized the main conditions where research-based developments, important research-based developments we're looking at in patient interventions delivered in the period between 1994 to 2013. And that, of course, that period is 16 years later than the research investment period we looked at, have accounted for, so we're looking at the ones that have accounted for the largest health gain in terms of qualities. Now, we work with experts. Obviously, we don't know all this stuff ourselves. We're not clinicians. We prioritize 9 conditions, for example, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, low back pain, and about 20 interventions, but some of the interventions overlap, so early and aggressive combination therapy for several types of arthritis. The next table shows a slightly simplified version of the list we used, but also the study was informed a bit by our case studies, for example, Winning et al. So you see earlier, I referred to having done the Payback Framework in combination sometimes with people around Europe. One of the studies we did collectively was looking at the impact of programs of research funded by Arthritis Research UK. So that was useful in here. So these are the 9 conditions here: rheumatoid arthritis, low back pain, etc., and the main interventions. These aren't the only interventions, of course, but these are the ones that seem to give the largest quality health gain. So the others, we had to take more steps though, which was for each included intervention, we had to identify relevant studies, secondary studies, that have estimated the lifetime quality gain and or the health service cost. So we had to estimate the number of new patients with any other conditions receiving each intervention in each year, to calculate the total quality gains derived from patients starting treatment each year, each intervention by year, and this was a total of 871,000 qualities. Then we had to place a monetary value on the qualities gained. Here we used really, well, the nice figure, the mid-range of the nice figure, which is 25,000 per quality. Again, lots of controversy there, but we basically said we're using the mid-range of what NICE uses. So that avoided us from getting into any controversy of saying, why did you calculate that figure? We didn't calculate it, we've used what NICE use. And that gave roughly a 28 billion pounds was the value of this, the monetary value of qualities gain. But of course, that takes costs, drugs, surgery time, etc., to achieve. And so we took off about 5.7 billion from that, and then ended up with about 16 billion pounds profit. So now, of course, I'm sure you're all aware that I grossly simplified things, of course, to try and get through all of this. And the actual total economic gains include GDP gains and as well as the net health gains. The GDP gains, this is like direct and indirect benefits, spillover effects of having public and charitable funded research in the UK, helps to boost pharmaceutical research. So that figure was 15 to 18% we found. Now this, important to emphasize, this is an internal rate of return. That means that for the investment, that's the rate of return that's achieved every single year. Now that's not just total investment, every single year, that is the rate of return. And so it's a very large figure. in terms of the rates of return, given that it accrues every year going forward. And that's the same for all the medical fields. Then for the net health gain was 7 to 10%. And this, of course, varied from field to field. So the 7% was for musculoskeletal, 9% for cardiovascular disease, and 10% for cancer. And so the total there, approximately 25% per year. So emphasizing again, this is every year you get that level. So this is a much higher rate of return than the Treasury usually require for public investments. And so we definitely say, I mean, this is a bit of a slide I've used when talking to musculoskeletal researchers, there's evidence to show it's worth spending money on research. And you see, we were talking earlier about how research assessment might be used. Well, this is an example of our study, our first study, being used as advocacy by the actual science minister himself within government. So it was an extract which we got permission to use from a letter to Jonathan Grant in October 2010 from the then science minister, who said that the report on medical research, what's it worth, regarded by BIS, this is Business Department analysts, very comprehensive and rigorous. It was used as evidence as part of preparations for spending review. Now, those of you who were in the UK at that time will remember that the 2010 spending review resulted in very severe cuts in many areas of public expenditure, but the science was largely saved. Now, that's all very well, but could we not try and do better in terms of the rate of return? It's already high, but why not see what you could do to make it go higher? So these are the various figures. This is for the first study we did, the cardiovascular disease, and our best estimate overall was a 9.2% internal rate of return, 9.2% every year. And here we've got the various figures of what this rate of return would be if we had a low estimate of research expenditure, a high estimate, and so on from all the various factors we considered. Now, what appears to be the biggest impact, perhaps by having either a lower or higher figure, would be the time lags. So instead of, in this instance, it was 17 years, infamous 17 years, instead of that, if it had been, in fact, if we'd miscalculated and it'd been a longer time lag, then in fact it would only have been a 5.6 rate of return. But if either we'd underestimated or you could reduce the time lag to 10 years, then in this case, the rate of return would go up to even higher, of 13.4%. Remember, this is just the health gain. You have the GDP gains come on top of that. So MRC funded us, more or less the same team, to try and understand, what are the time lags between basic research and going right through to its application. Well, our papers, we were reviews and 7 case studies broadly reinforce the off-cited claims about time lags from early research to health gains, often being around 17 years. In fact, the case studies showed it could be longer. So the AAA screening study, as I showed you, was from 1983 to 2009 in the UK. It was actually a slightly shorter period in the US. One of the other things we came up with, and this was very much Martin Buxton's inputs, was the concept of cues and how you could use this as an explanatory factor, so that if you look back with hindsight at the time between early research and the health gain, the application of the research in practice, there often might seem to be delays. So you might think, well, why was research not funded more rapidly? Why do they have to spend so long getting their funding? Why was it so long in the regulators getting cleared at various stages? Now, of course, that's with hindsight. At the time, it might not have been obvious that X should have had priority over Y or Z. So there would always be queues for research funding resources, queues for ethical approval, queues for all the steps that the regulators. They can't look at everything at once. So queues are a very important concept and become particularly important when we move on to look at the COVID vaccines. Other things we found were the situations where resources either did or could speed up the process. But if you provide more resources, you can speed things up. So, for example, one of our case studies was on cognitive behavioural therapy. And there we found there was a long delay because there wasn't actually the capacity of staff to provide this. And when some more money was provided, then the whole process of translation was speeded up. Regulators, we found, sometimes adopted different benefit risk profiles to speed up processes in emergencies. So HIV/AIDS was an example of that, and also sometimes there was patient demand. But perhaps a major contribution that we made was a matrix of parallel or overlapping tracks. And this added to the flexibility in the analysis of translation. And it can be more accurate that it can account for reality. So we didn't come up with any new tracks or any new stages or phases of research or translation, but rather we produced this matrix which suggested you could look at them as overlapping tracks. And as we saw in the AA case study, despite the overall period being long, there were still some examples of overlapping in that. So this is the matrix that we developed. You see here, this is the paper, the references at the end. Again, the team was Brunel, around Europe, and in this instance, the Office of Health Economics, funded by the MRC. And as I say, none of these tracks or phases are new developments, but what we've done is to put them in this sort of overlapping way, and so parallel work can go on. And we've also called them tracks rather than sort of streams. The idea of a track being that you can move maybe both ways along a track at times, and you can move from one track to the next track and go along that, and maybe then you have to go down and not just go up. And so we found that this was gave us quite a lot of flexibility in the analysis. So you've got the most basic, the discovery research. Obviously, the various terms are used, different terms use different people, are used by different people. The definitions can vary quite considerably. But basically, this is the basic discovery research. And then you have the first in humans, the safety, the phase 1 trials, the dosage design trials, phase 2, efficacy trial, phase 3, and you can apply somewhat parallel ideas to other areas, not just to perhaps sort of pharmaceutical developments. And then there's also what's sometimes called phase 4, or the effectiveness or post-launch research. So you might want to know, is this new drug actually cost effective, or is it, you compare its cost effectiveness with that of another drug that does the same thing. So that's not to show whether or not this one works, it's to show whether or not, say, drug X works better than drug Y. And then there are also reviews and syntheses on the effectiveness. So all that are the sort of, all those are the human research stages, and the whole thing here are the research stages. Then we move on to the sort of clinical and health service public policy tracks, and absolutely crucial, the regulatory approval for first sort of non-use research in patients and monitoring. But also quite often there will be some sorts of national policy announcements that something is being approved. Something is being, not only has it been regulatory approved, but they recommend its use, so maybe guidelines. And there also have to be reimbursement decisions. How is this new, maybe very expensive drug or device or whatever, how is it going to be paid for? So there have to be some body to make those decisions. And then there's the clinical practice track. But you see, again, there'll be overlaps. So with all these, there's potential for, they don't always overlap. Quite often, there won't necessarily be overlaps. Quite often, the things will be linear, particularly in the research phases. Traditionally, you don't start phase 2, you don't start phase 1 until you've done your animal research. You don't start phase 2 until you've done the safety. You don't do the efficacy until you've done the dosage and design, and so on. And so, in many cases, these would actually be, it would be linear here, and they wouldn't be overlapping. But what we analysed and what we found a few examples of was that sometimes they do overlap. So it's perfectly theoretically possible to think of them as overlapping and for things running in parallel. And in practice, it can happen at times. And so that takes us on to 2020. And we thought, well, maybe these ideas could help interpret, analyze what's going on with the rapid COVID vaccine development. So this is our paper that same team again published in June 2020. So it was mostly written in March and April, revised in May. I emphasize that because, of course, there have been quite an awful lot going on since that. So if you looked at the paper, you might think, oh, well, for instance, they don't mention certain things. Well, some cases, like the Pfizer-BioNTech, that was not one of the ones that received much publicity in the early stages. It suddenly burst onto the scene, but more or less it burst on about the time that we finished doing our writing. But the principles apply to it as apply to others. So what we did to start with was, we looked back at our paper that I've just been talking about, and also the various blogs we wrote on dissemination, when we tried in particular to pick out factors that could be thought to reduce the time. So one of which was increasing resources. That seems to be obvious, but thinking about what could be particularly done with increased resources. Well, you could address those issues that are caused by queues. If you're queuing for research funding, well, then more resources mean more research can be funded more rapidly. And similarly, if you have more ethics committees, you have more regulatory, more people working in the regulatory organisations, it can get more done. And also, there's sometimes a lack of implementation capacity, as we saw. More resources can help address that. And increasing resources also can help achieve some of the other points here. So improve processes, so you can improve regulatory processes, and in particular improve the research processes that will speed things up, and speed things up both along the tracks and between the tracks. So remember, things will go along a track and then up to the next track. Then working in parallel. This is what the matrix highlighted, the scope for working in parallel and overlapping tracks. To do things in more than one phase at one time enables all the phases, all the stages to be completed more rapidly. And then the controversial areas of starting at risk or working at risk. Now, safety risk, now I emphasize, we were looking here at safety risk during trials. So not anything to do with safety risks for patients eventually being given it, but during the trials. And the point here was that there was a scope for liaising with the regulators about whether you could do things in a later phase before completing the current phase. And then there's also a big issue about companies. One of the reasons why things have gone more slowly is that traditionally companies wait the full results of one trial phase before going on to the next phase, because generally each of the phases that I showed are larger and therefore they're a lot more expensive. Now, with the pandemic, with extra public funding, and of course with the urgency of the pandemic, companies were happy to risk. So it's a financial risk by investing more, by working in parallel in the various phases. So looking then, applying each of these to the specifics of the COVID vaccine development, increasing resources, as you're probably aware, very large amounts of money are provided for expensive trials, directly by governments, so the US, UK, etc., and by an organisation called CEPI, which hasn't got so much attention, but a very important organisation. It's an international organisation. Gates, again, are wonderfully generous. Gates Foundation have put in millions here, welcome, and also various governments. And then also, there's the question of the urgency and the resource concentration when very little else was going on. So remember, we're talking about there being queues. Well, as many people know, a lot of other medical research had to be put on hold during the COVID crisis because of the issues of social distancing, etc. So actually, there was not only were there more resources put into the COVID vaccine, but also there was an unprecedented concentration of resources. So this particular area got massively more funding than anything else. And the concentration also meant that, COVID vaccine, it would go immediately to the top of any queues, funding, ethics, or regulatory decisions. But of course, often the queues didn't really exist anyway, because there wasn't much else going on. Then improved processes. So the Jenner Institute at Oxford, they had been working to improve their processes, to design a platform for creating a new vaccines for what they called disease X. So this is a quote from Sarah Gilbert. How could we mobilize and focus our resources to go more quickly than we'd ever done before? That's what they've been working on. And then she said, disease X arrived, COVID. That comes from a quote which again, give reference for from her in the Lancet. Then similarly, Moderna in the US and BioNTech in Germany, they had separately been working to develop the idea of mRNA vaccines, a novel technology that stimulates the body's own immune responses. So, and then across the medical fields, much greater use made of preprints, WHO coordinated global conference calls, press releases were used much more, so knowledge spread much more rapidly than ever before. And also the regulatory bodies and WHO agreed approaches to slimline requirements for case animal studies. Now, some people might question the extent to which the last 2 points are really improvements in the processes. Obviously, there's an active debate going on about that now, but they certainly speeded things up. So starting or working at risk. So the meeting of the regulatory bodies and WHO decided that it wasn't always necessary to conduct or complete animal challenge studies before phase 1 human trials. That was something new. So in mid-May, Moderna, for example, simultaneously published reports on their potentially promising phase 1 results and an animal challenge study. And in an awful lot of this, the vaccine developers and the regulators liaised. So it wasn't that the vaccine developers were taking risks, and again, this is risks, perhaps possible risks, with the people in the trials. They weren't taking risks that hadn't been fully discussed and approved by the regulators. So the level of liaison that was going on between the regulators and the vaccine developers was unprecedented. So I mean, I say at the top here that many of these points overlap and reinforce each other. So you could say an improved process was that the vaccine developers and regulators, they were liaising so much. And of course, they could do that because there weren't other things queuing up to use the regulators' time. And then the financial risks were reduced. And again, this is what overlaps with the increased resources. About billions of pounds invested in accelerating the development and production in a range of vaccine candidates by, well, I'm sure you've heard, Operation Warp Speed. Moderna was included, but interesting, not the development of Pfizer BioNTech. And also CEPI put in lots of money. And then we come back to the working in parallel. So we're looking at the matrix again, and some points covered above that were facilitated by the existence of these overlaps. So while Oxford preclinical research was underway and received ethical approval for clinical trials, they also received approval for their clinical trials, and they started screening the volunteers who would be used in the clinical trials whilst they were still doing the preclinical work. Then they used safety data from previous vaccine trials using the similar techniques to discuss with regulators the basis on which they could start a combined phase 2, phase 3 trial. Similarly, US companies were in regular iteration with the FDA about progressing trial phases in parallel, and Dr. Fauci was playing a key role in this. And then manufacturing companies also unusually were developing their capacity in parallel. And there's an article by Laurie et al. Which looks at lots of things going on in parallel, but they particularly talk about the manufacturing capacity, which hadn't really been a feature of our model. And then often lengthy policy and reimbursement tracks were sort of sorted out. All the delays, often years of delays there, were obviously just sorted out in this case before the regulatory approval. So just to finish on then, going back to our matrix. So I think, if you want to, and we can come back to questions on this, trying to understand, perhaps interpret what has happened with the vaccine development. So some of this discovery research, as we've seen from Oxford and from Moderna, etc., and BioNTech, this was going on before the period we studied. It was going on before COVID-19 was actually identified, but it was going on for seeing how you could use, potentially develop vaccines, how you could develop platforms that you could use when the specific virus was known. So that goes back a bit further. Then, as we've seen, these trials were going on in parallel with, in some cases, or with the animal research. And they started some of these phases 2, phases 3, before necessarily completing, or certainly before publishing the findings from the safety trial. This one doesn't apply yet, of course, neither does this one. This is the absolute crucial other element then, regulatory approval. But again, this is where the system helps. See, overlapping. So yeah, a lot of the discussions, the findings from this were going to the regulator as they were being produced. They didn't wait until they, as you normally do, till you finish the trial before sending your data to the regulator. It was going, they were backwards and forwards all the time. Backwards and forwards to approve going on to the next phase, backwards and forwards for the phase 3. So they had the mounting evidence ready to act much more quickly again than usual. And by the time this had been done, this had already been sorted out, how it's going to be done, how it's going to be paid for in the various countries. So as soon as a regulatory approval was, then it goes right up here to the top into regular clinical practice, and we're all being jabbed. So I have got at the end, when it comes around, to some references to these various points. So that's the end of the presentation, and perhaps there'll be a few questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. That was a lot of information and really informative. And we've gotten some comments already that people are really appreciating your talk. So we have a few questions going on. Just really, I think the first one is about your opinion, and maybe you could talk about how this might affect research funding or the ability to rapidly speed up research. So the question is about conspiracy theories against the COVID-19 vaccine. And there's a lot of even scholars and physicians and researchers from the US and misreporting about the vaccine. So do you have any opinions about conspiracy theories or misinformation and how that might affect some of the issues you've discussed?
Well, I think that obviously lots and lots of people have been doing this brilliant work. So there's great danger of appearing to overemphasize our own role, which I don't in the slightest. I mean, our analysis hasn't contributed one iota to the work of those people who have developed it. And we are finding this, it's beginning to be cited in various pieces of work. So, for example, only a couple of days ago, in a very important paper in the Lancet that was analysing how the global rollout of the vaccine should happen. And so when people are trying to analyse things, then I think this and some of the text of what I've said, the whole issue of cues, might just help to explain a little bit as to how it is that a drug could be developed safely developed, much safely for those who receive it, much more rapidly than previously. So it isn't that key phases were missed out. Okay, this phase being missed out, this isn't a phase that checks safety. This is one, and it might come in this field later on when you're checking. Next round, are we going to have expensive drug from Moderna that's many times more expensive than the AstraZeneca drug? But that was irrelevant this time. Similarly, you don't need to do the synthesis at this time. So all the key phases were done, and this is what is shown. It's just that it was so much more quickly because they were done in parallel, they were done overlapping. I mean, some of these phase 3 trials were massive. thousands, 30,000 people in a lot of them. So, all of the safety work was done. And the other thing that so again, we show how you can speed things up. Things are so much quicker because of all this iteration with the regulatory approval bodies in a way that's never done before. Now, it doesn't mean that the regulatory arrangements were skimping, but what it means is they were focusing on this. So they were full time virtually. Certainly in the UK, there's complicated reasons why, always 100% focusing on this. So it was that things were done, all the important things were done, they weren't missed out, but they were done in ways that were much more rapid. More resources meant all the manufacturing capacity was made available. And people have been working on improving the processes beforehand. So it's not just something that has happened since coronavirus. Since the new disease was identified, it was going on for other coronaviruses beforehand, developing the ideas. So I don't know what that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So the next question is more about health systems and policy. So the question is, how can we showcase the benefit of positive health benefits of research, especially to the policymakers in societies where health research systems are weak? So where should we start in strengthening the health research systems capacities of a country or province?
Well, you're asking me to be immodest again. I mean, we have just earlier this year, in fact, earlier last year, we published a review that we had done for the World Health Organization of the literature on strengthening health research systems. So this is very much one of the areas that do look at. And there are frameworks around of how health research systems are best organized. And the key thing is we tend to think trying to take a comprehensive approach. And the NIHR in the UK, I know it's not the only fund by any means, but the whole structure that Sally Davis created, it covered all the things that you needed to do. So it covered the trying to set priorities that reflected the needs of the healthcare system. It covered building the capacity that you needed in the healthcare systems itself. The resources were provided, partly because it was being seen to do a good work, and then also by trying to integrate as far as possible the health research system into the healthcare system. This helps with meaning that the research that is done is more relevant to the healthcare system, and B, obviously linked with that, more likely to be used. So there are, and as you say, we did this review for WHO and showed that we found probably in the UK, NIHR gone furthest, but some other cases, other examples, very interesting. So Rwanda has developed a health research system quite systematically and has made a lot of progress. So that there are examples, a few examples around the world in countries with fewer resources that do seem to have made progress. I wouldn't say we studied Rwanda in great detail, but certainly there is some evidence there, some internal evidence from within the WHO Africa, who have looked at health research systems in all the African countries, and they identify the Rwandan system as having lots of the elements in place that are likely to lead to a health research system that will produce research that's relevant for improving health of the local health system itself.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm just going to read the next one out because it's a bit of a long one. So it says, questions born from ever-present need for individual research funders, especially public or charitable, to justify their funding budgets allocations. With new machine-based tools to track, especially amount of research investments in research, publication, policy, citation, Could you envisage a what's worth light methodology that gets some way to consistently estimating respective contributions to health gains, if not value or same, or there are just too many unknowns for that to happen?
Well, there are picking up on the certain bit, there are certainly lots of unknowns. I mean, I try to keep emphasizing that what we were doing were estimates, and that there were you've always taken into account there are low figures and high figures. We gained a little bit more confidence by the fact that the figures that we came up with, the internal rate of return, was not that different for three highly different areas. And we also, the first time, looked very briefly but at mental health research. And so, obviously, three doesn't prove things, but it gave us a little bit more confidence. Despite the, and so to answer the particular question, the more data that can be gathered, and there certainly are more ways now of gathering data, then the stronger the evidence should become. So I mean, we've got to, you might not want to move away from the sort of basic elements of what you needed to look at. But so you probably wouldn't want to maybe not move away much from this framework, but being able to gather the data on each of those items, you might be able to do much more comprehensively with the sorts of data gathering analysis approaches that are being developed now. It's off the top of my head,
No, that's great. And this is actually very exciting because we have a question from one of the other presenters, Professor Matan Hayworth, whose talk is on March 11th. Professor Matan Hayworth is saying, one of the complexities for preventative health research is how do you build the case for investing in activity that might prevent something from happening in the future? Some of this links, for example, to the things you were saying about investment in Oxford, about anticipatory processes before COVID. And if it assessed at that time, no one could have anticipated later events and the impact. So what are your thoughts on that for investing in activities that could be for unintended consequences later?
Well, one thing, in terms of preventative research, that, of course, is a very important element of the research that is done by colleagues at Brunel, by Subhash, and by Nana. So in how in the economics of research, so it's doing health economics research to show the benefits of interventions to prevent smoking and to encourage physical activity, encourage breastfeeding. So, and I mean, a lot of analysis has been done to show that preventative measures, so on, so tobacco control, public health measures like that, actually produce the greatest rate of return in terms of the investment that a healthcare system can make. And so the research that helps to show these rates of return can be useful in strengthening the case. It is, of course, the challenge is that a lot of the preventative activities, so like tobacco control, are really looking at population levels, whereas once people have got an illness, then the treatment for them is treatment for X individual. And so that is why perhaps not as much resources of the NHS goes on the more cost-effective areas of prevention, rather than on providing the care for people once they've become ill. So there's certainly the research can help to build the case. So the health economics research can help build the case for preventative actions. In terms of the perhaps longer term building capacity, it is true that one of the comprehensive things that is in the NIHR, in the strategy of Sally Davis, is that there are many elements covered. So there are biomedical research centres, some of their funding will be on research that perhaps will have a longer time perspective. So I think that having the comprehensive strategy is very valuable. And it's also the case, I think, that, and you could say this with AAA showed, that by having some examples of mega levels of benefit from the health research, that does help provide something of an umbrella, under which then all sorts of other research can take place, and you can legitimately make the argument that this is all part of a comprehensive system, and it won't necessarily be that you can show the impacts of all of it, but that it all sort of perhaps meshes together and makes sense, and that you can show the really high rate of return from a few examples, and that can justify a lot of expenditure.
Well, thanks, Steve. So we have one last question, and it's about open science. So the question is, you mentioned preprints as in one example of open science used to speed up the publication process during COVID. What are your thoughts on the use of open science research practices such as preprints, open data, and their use during COVID-19 and maybe beyond?
Well, certainly, I mean, they've been very important during COVID. And there's been an absolute explosion. So I think it's been said that the medical research field tended to use preprints less than some of the physical sciences. But COVID has seen that completely sort of overturned. And it has actually been some of the leading players in the sort of traditional publication who have been at the forefront of this. So Nature has created a sort of preprint system, and some of the areas, some of the journals, some of the publishers are almost insisting that things go into open access before they are then published. It's astonishingly reversal in just a few days, in a few months. And what must be the best example, I mean, there are obviously dangers, and people are aware of the dangers. So there have some attempts on writing some of the best preprints to actually do some editorial control. So obviously it can be limited, but they are aware of the dangers. So it is going to be important to try and find the balance of this. But perhaps the best example of openly being open with the findings is the research that was also done at Oxford that found that corticosteroids were a very important therapy and reduced the death rate enormously. Now, that finding was really released in a press release at noon, and basically by that evening, it was being widely implemented right across the NHS. Now, it's difficult to argue that the lives that were saved by doing that shouldn't have been saved. On the other hand, you've got the whole hydroxychloroquine fiasco that shows the dangers. But if you leave things to the internal science community, there are definite advantages.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your time and your expertise. You can join us next week as our Global Health Challenges and Opportunities Insight from the Expert series continues. We'll have Professor Ravi Mehrotra talking about challenges in breast cancer control in India. So thank you, everyone, for your time and your participation, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks very much.